Hey everyone, welcome back to Satanix Reviews. With the new Joker movie released recently, I think it's a good time for me to discuss a few Batman movies. Now don't worry, I won't discuss every single one, but I will be going over the four that started in the late 80s and ended in the late 90s. I'll be discussing these movies individually, so this will be more of a collection of reviews instead of one review. Either way, these Batman movies were all made in response to how the comics and the Adam West TV shows were seen as too goofy and lighthearted. Thus, the comics decided to take a darker turn, with Frank Miller giving his own take. But he wasn't the only contributor to making a dark tone to The Dark Knight. Tim Burton was a big deal in the 80s, with movies like Ed Wood and Beetlejuice being successes, so he was given the job of directing the first ever Batman movie since the 60s. The first movie was just called Batman, but many call it either Batman '89 or Tim Burton's Batman. I believe either because, in all fairness, that's exactly what it is. This movie isn't the closest adaptation of the comics. In fact, a lot of people over the years have criticized it for making a lot of changes to the beloved characters. Nowadays, we have The Batman for a more authentic Batman movie, but people such as myself don't mind changes being made as long as the overall product is still a unique experience. When I talk to people personally now, they either prefer this movie or The Dark Knight. However, when this movie was being made, a lot of hate was spreading once people heard that Michael Keaton was going to play the role of Batman himself. Apparently, I heard that it's because he was in Mr. Mom, which I haven't seen, but I'm aware of its premise because I've seen the concept in a ton of other movies afterward. Regardless, I didn't know who he was, and I had no frame of reference for the other movies he was in. I say this because when I first saw this guy in the Batman suit, I didn't just see an actor in the role. I felt like I was seeing Batman on screen in the same way Christopher Reeve felt like he was Superman's character come to life. Of course, you still need a villain to match how interesting your hero is. That's where the Joker comes in. Jack Nicholson plays the role as if he was already playing it his entire life. Nicholson is just one of those unique actors where you can never tell what he's going to do in his role. Is he going to be a sarcastic wise-ass, a laughing maniac, or just do whatever the hell he wants? With that said, many have stated that this movie seems to be more focused on the Joker than Batman. We don't get a backstory for Bruce aside from a flashback of his parents being shot, but we see what the Joker's backstory is, so there isn't much mystery to his history. However, I think that's the point. Burton likes to create his outcasts dressed in black, and Batman is certainly that outcast with how distant he is from everyone. However, he has a line saying that he has to do this because no one else can. That line pretty much just sums up his character perfectly for me. Meanwhile, the Joker is loud and craving attention, but again, that's part of his character. Other characters include Vicky Vale, a reporter who has a weird fascination with bats, but makes for a very supportive love interest, despite the fact that she screams way too many times in the movie. Alfred, Bruce's butler and caring guardian, Commissioner Gordon, who granted isn't my favorite interpretation, but Pat Hingle's acting makes his role pretty memorable, and a ton of other side characters. Probably my favorite side character is this one henchman of the Joker's named Bob. I have no idea what his character is supposed to be other than the Joker's a number one, a guy, as the Joker says. But whenever this guy appears, he's just cool to watch despite not getting many lines. Apparently, one of the biggest problems people have with this movie is, like I said, that it doesn't feel like the best adaptation of the comics. There's one moment where Alfred lets Vale into the Batcave, and this moment got so much backlash. Personally, I feel like she already figured out Bruce's identity, and you can tell Alfred is just trying to keep their relationship stable. Either way, this movie has a great cast, but what about the rest of the movie? Well, the action is pretty fun to watch, feeling more gritty and aggressive than other comic book movies before then. There's a good mix of special and practical effects, but Some of them look a little stop motion. The first shot you see of Batman makes him look like he's from The Nightmare Before Christmas. Now, to be fair, this was meant to be intentional. Burton wanted a few of these special effects to look cheap, but some of them admittedly look kind of lame. With that said, the sets, costume designs, and even the Batmobile are pretty well made. This movie's Gotham is one of my favorite looking versions, and the Batmobile looks just as I imagine it'd look. Then there's the music. Danny Elfman does a fantastic job composing, and this might be my favorite soundtrack of his. Nightmare Before Christmas would obviously be a very close second for me, but this movie's main theme just makes me go, hell yeah. There isn't much plot going on in this movie, it's just the Joker exists and Batman's trying to stop him. But you don't need much else as long as the movie is still entertaining. Overall, this movie is easily among my most rewatched, especially for comic book movies. Keaton's take on Bruce is one of my favorite characters in cinema for just how likable he is. The memorable cast gives me every reason to rewatch it. I'm giving this movie a 10 out of 10. Again, as I said from Kirby Superstar Ultra, this doesn't mean the movie's perfect, but I enjoy it that much. So Batman '89 was very successful when it first came out, both financially and in terms of audience enjoyment. Thus, Burton was given full control of the sequel, Batman Returns. Before I get to this one, though, I should point out that the original script for Batman '89 was pretty insane. A lot of rewrites had to happen until Warner Brothers was satisfied with the overall product. Sam Hamm wrote the final draft of the script for the first movie and the first draft of this movie's script. However, the script was rewritten by several other writers. And oh boy, does that show. This had a lot of the same cast and crew as the first movie, but this had a completely different tone and style. Even as a freaking 12-year-old, this movie was way too intense for me. Even to this day, I have no idea how this got a PG-13 because this movie is straight up R-rated. Biting people's noses off, a woman being tossed out of a building just to have a mental breakdown at home, several murders committed, and even the main villain threatening to drown kids. I didn't like this movie when I first saw it. It was just way too intense and graphic for me. Once I got older, though, however, it got both better and worse. Keaton is back, as well as Hingle as Commissioner Gordon and Michael Goff as Alfred, but there is a new cast of characters. Not all of them are as memorable as the first movie's cast, but the villains are all very fun to watch. Of course, there's good old Danny as the Penguin, and Pfeiffer as Catwoman. But Christopher Walken as one of your movie's villains, Max Schreck? Yeah, you're in for a weird movie. This guy just has the most bizarre deliveries, but it's so entertaining. I don't even know if it's a good performance or not, it just makes me laugh. The Penguin is fun to watch too, but he might be the biggest problem of the movie. While there's nothing wrong with the performance itself, the directing is very jumbled. Sometimes you're supposed to feel sorry for him, and sometimes you're supposed to hate him. Sure, we see his parents try to drown him at the beginning, but he grows up and decides to kill all the firstborns. The reason for this is because he was supposed to be related to Max Schreck, thus giving him a reason for wanting to kill firstborns like Shrek. However, this wasn't written in the final draft, so it's just random. Even if that was the case, he still has this relentless, gross nastiness throughout the entire movie. Funny enough, this issue was fixed just with a different character, Selena Kyle, aka Catwoman. Everyone says that the Penguin creeps him out, but Pfeiffer's take on Catwoman was outright scary to me as a kid. Between the cats nipping at her after she's been pushed out of a window, the insane breakdown she has at home, I was convinced this was some horror or psychological thriller. You know what, though? I love it. This movie is so relentlessly cruel and mean-spirited that I find it so much fun to watch for how over-the-top dark it gets. There are some elements I can defend, like Selena Kyle's story arc, the look of the film, Max Shrek's plan to feed off of others' energy for his power plant, but everything else is more of an acquired taste. If what I've described sounds like what The Dark Knight deserves in a theatrical release, by all means check out how brutal this movie can get. However, if this sounds like too much for you to handle, I understand that as well. It is supposed to be a comic book movie, so it should have some level of campiness or fun to it. I see this as fun, but it may not be fun for other people. With that said, I give credit to the fact that this movie takes one of my least favorite cliches, and somehow I don't mind it here. Without giving anything away, Batman gets framed for a murder committed, and I don't have any problem with this whole good guy looking like the bad guy, while the bad guy looks like the good guy cliche in a Batman movie. I'm used to him being seen as untrustworthy, and to be fair, it isn't focused on for very long, so maybe that's why I don't mind it here. I really hate this trope, but I kind of liked it in this movie as well as Mask of the Phantasm. Speaking of which, I won't be discussing that movie here today, despite it also being a theatrical film. Anyway, moving back to Batman Returns. This movie also got a lot of flack, not just for being too dark, but also because once again, it wasn't seen as accurate to the comics. Batman can't kill anyone, it's against his code, yada yada. First, it was Vale being let into the Batcave, by the way, which was completely crapped on by this movie. And no, it's not a good line. Now, Batman can't kill anyone? It's just a different version. Not to mention, Batman has clearly broken quite a few rules in the comics, so I don't see how these details ruin a movie. Just judge the movies as they are. Overall, I'm giving this movie an 8.5 out of 10. Realistically, I'd give this a 6 or a 7, but it's still very entertaining for me. While Batman Returns didn't bomb, it didn't make nearly as much of a profit as the first movie did. Thus, Burton was demoted to being a producer for the next movie, while the late Joel Schumacher took over directing it. This resulted in Warner Brothers taking control once again for a more family-friendly Batman movie. However, they went way overboard, and it resulted in Batman Forever. As a kid, this was my favorite Batman movie, but that's only because Jim Carrey was in it. I was just getting into his comedies like The Mask and Ace Ventura, so I just loved anything he was in. Little did I realize I was only judging the movie for having comedy than treating it as a Batman movie. As a Batman movie, this is so bad. But as a movie by itself, it's fine. Aside from Hingle and Goff, none of the cast members return to reprise their roles. Val Kilmer takes the role of Batman this time. At first I thought his Batman was kind of phony, but I feel like he makes a better Bruce Wayne than Batman. The biggest drawback to his Batman is the same drawback to all the actors in the movie. They're all really banking on making this feel like an Adam West Batman episode. The problem with that is that those episodes were cheap to make and they could be pretty funny. This clearly connected to the serious movies, though, and yet it still had a different tone and style. There are some exceptions, like Robin's character, who granted looks too old for the role, but his costume looks pretty good, and he is taken seriously. And Carrie is at first pretty seriously taken when he's not being made for just purely comedy as the Riddler. but the rest of the cast is way too over the top. There are just some weird acting moments that I can't tell if they're meant to be funny or not, and there are quite a few innuendos between Bruce and his love interest, Chase Meridian. By far the worst actor in this movie, though, goes to Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face. Yeah, insert mention of how this clearly isn't the same actor as Billy D. Williams, but that's not my main problem. Neither is it the fact that he acts like a complete buffoon after stating he despised every moment of working with Carrie because of his overacting. It's the fact that he feels absolutely nothing like the original character due to the fact that I think he's trying to be the Joker half the time. He always smiles even when he's screaming angrily. I have no idea what this guy's character is supposed to be, but I admit that it is pretty damn funny. It is a shame we don't get an authentic Two-Face in these movies, but this is still a fascinatingly failed role, and hey, we did get a much better Two-Face in The Dark Knight. Carrie as the Riddler, while better acted, is kind of annoying now. I do like the idea of him having to use his invention to feed off of people so that he can gain personal information, very similar to hacking nowadays, but it's still handled pretty silly. The look of this film is sometimes really impressive. It doesn't look at all like a Batman movie, but this movie can still be absolutely gorgeous to look at when it's not looking like a PS1 video game cutscene, because the special effects in this movie do not hold up at all. With that said, the sets, costume designs, and makeup can look pretty good. I feel like this is a movie where you need to be really forgiving to get into. The tone is way too goofy, but it does have a few serious moments to help it stand out a little. It's not a movie for everyone, but it might be worth checking out just to see if it's your thing or not. I'll give this movie a 6 out of 10. It's not terrible, but it's nothing special either. It's hard to say whether or not Burton would have made this movie better or worse, but his vision probably would have been more unique. Now, we come to the big one. Batman Forever was such a big hit at the box office, getting even more money than Batman Returns, so Schumacher was given full control of the next movie, like how Burton was given full control over Batman Returns. This once again led to the same results as Batman Returns, but this time it was even worse. In all fairness, Schumacher did apologize to Batman fans who hated this movie and Forever, so it sounds like he was modest about this, but what's a bad movie is still a bad movie. Kilmer was replaced with George Clooney, who granted has been funny in other movies, but definitely this is not one of them. While some actors in Forever look like they were taking things seriously, everyone in this movie is just acting like they're in an Adam West episode. And dear God, none of the jokes are funny. In fact, this was my first Batman movie, but even I was getting bored of it quickly. After the first 15 to 20 minutes, I just ended up checking the time to see how much longer this movie was going to be. This movie is about as long as the other three movies, but this felt so much slower in my opinion. It also didn't help that the main actors were pretty bad. The absolute worst actor in this movie is Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze. We went from the animated series, where Freeze was treated as a Shakespearean villain with a tragic backstory that gives him the motivation to revive the love of his life, to this loud, goofy villain who does nothing but make ice puns for most of his dialogue. Arnold's portrayal is so terrible, but it's also kind of fascinating. The fact that this movie had the balls to give him the same backstory as the animated series just makes things more insane. With that said, the rest of the cast is weirdly not bad enough. Uma Thurman is entertaining at first, but once she becomes Poison Ivy, she feels like she's underacting. They try to make her sexy, and it just comes off as lame. Bane is in this movie as well, but you really could just cut him out of this movie and you wouldn't miss a thing. He has so little dialogue, and he only is in one or two action scenes. Batgirl, aka Barbara Gordon, oh sorry, Barbara Wilson, according to IMDb, is added to this movie, but she's Alfred's niece instead of Commissioner Gordon's daughter. Speaking of which, Alfred becomes one of the main plot points of the movie. He comes down with the same sickness as Freeze's wife, which could claim his life. This feels phoned in because, God forbid, we don't have enough plot lines in this movie. Between Freeze wanting Gotham to pay for his wife's fate, Ivy wanting to, I don't know, take over the world, and Robin being whiny about having Bruce constantly being better than him. I feel like this is just thrown in because there isn't enough conflict going on in the movie. I get it that comic book movies do this often, but none of them are interesting or entertaining. This movie seems more concerned about making bad jokes anyway. I get it that this is supposed to be more lighthearted and goofy, but the 60s Batman show was cheap and intentionally stupid. This clearly had a big budget. You need to pay to see it, and it still has some of the same actors from the Burton movies, the ones that were meant to be taken seriously. In the end, that's not even my main problem with this movie. People can go on and on about how this movie is too stupid, cheesy, over the top, unfunny, or terribly acted, but my main complaint is that it's boring. I don't see this movie as a funny or fun type of bad. It's just a dull kind of bad. The type of bad that makes me bored. I don't hate this movie like other people do, but I see no reason to rewatch this movie either. I like watching other people tear this movie apart, but I've seen movies that bored me or insulted me more. Aside from the look of the movie and some of Goff's acting as Alfred, I can't think of any positives to give it. Either way, this movie gets a 4 out of 10. It's pretty bad, and a tragic way to end these movies, but I could think of worse ways. So, this concludes my reviews of the four Batman movies that started with the '89 Burton film. It's a clear example of what happens when comic book movies try to grab audiences' attention without taking into consideration that making things more kid-friendly isn't the best course of action. With that said, you can probably tell that I prefer the darker entries over the lighthearted ones. So, those are the ones I continue to watch over and over again, while the other two, while I find them fascinating products of their time, aren't movies I really come back to. I'm aware there must be at least 20 plus Batman movies out there, and I'll get to those eventually. But I'll wait until the time comes for those. Until then, thanks for watching.